Good afternoon, everybody. Very hard to get an attention after such a panel, but we'll try to do so. If everybody could please sit down. Thank you. On June 1st, exactly 50 years ago and 3 weeks, at the height of the tension in the Middle East, the Israeli government was trying to understand what exactly the U.S. government is trying to signal it to do, what the U.S. government wants Israel, how it wants Israel to proceed. President Johnson told Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban, Israel will not be alone unless it decides to go it alone, whatever that means. The CIA head of station, head of delegation in Israel, John Haddon, threatened Israel and said to the chief of the Mossad, if you strike Israel, the U.S. would deploy forces to help Egypt and defend it. And so Israel wanted to know, and Prime Minister Levi Eshkol sent the chief of the Mossad at that time, General Meir Amit, to meet with the U.S. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. The chief of the Mossad told him, Mr. Secretary, Israel reserved the right to defend itself. To which Secretary McNamara said, go home, young man, this is where you need to be now. And the chief of the Mossad, Meir Amit, understood that phrase, go home, young man, this is where you need to be now, as a flashing green light to start a war. The secretary himself said afterwards that it was indeed flashing light, but it was yellow, if not red. In any case, Amit understood what he understood from McNamara, and the green light was given to the war. I wonder, nowadays, or in recent past, what would be the outcome if Meir Amit would be meeting with President Obama? What sort of answer would he give to Israel need to defend itself? And would that be the same answer as would be given by President Trump? Or, as Monty Python once said, we are talking about something completely different. In any case, this story is just another one among many, an ample proof how profoundly important are the relationship between Israel and the United States, how influential they are on the region, on the whole world, and how important the coordination between the two governments is. I think that we have today the best cadre of experts to deal with this topic, and I will introduce them in a few minutes. But first, I would like to call important guest that honored the Herzliya conference in coming, the Ambassador Tina Kaidanow, Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs. Ambassador Kaidanow is the Department of State Principal Liaison with the Department of Defense and manages several critical components of the U.S. foreign policy, including the maintenance of State Department global security relationship. She served since February 2014 as Ambassador and Coordinator for Counterterrorism, previously as Deputy Ambassador at the U.S. Embassy and Ambassador at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, and prior to that, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. From 2006 to 2009, she was Chief of Mission and later the first U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Kosovo. I can go on and on with this very impressive track record, but we are here to hear the Ambassador. So, Ambassador Kaidanow, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Sorry for the height challenged among us. There you go. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored to be here today and to participate in this esteemed conference. Thanks. And to speak about the future of U.S.-Israeli relations, especially at such an important and notable time as we approach your nation's 70th anniversary of independence, and as we face a number of mutual challenges, both regionally and globally. I'd like to first extend a special thanks to Amos Gilad, who, in his previous capacity at the Ministry of Defense in the policy realm, was an essential interlocutor for us, and I think he continues in his present role to encourage and to facilitate the strategic quality of our interaction, as today's forum is, I think, precisely designed to do. During his recent trip to Israel, President Trump articulated a deep and abiding commitment to strengthening the special relationship the United States enjoys with Israel. Secretary of State Tillerson has also consistently emphasized that Israel remains the United States' closest partner in the Middle East, an invaluable ally with whom we share many overlapping strategic interests. In my previous position as the State Department's coordinator for counterterrorism, and now in my current role as the Assistant Secretary for Political Military Affairs, I've personally been a part of the ever-deepening operational collaboration between our two countries, aimed at addressing the many, many issues that we are grappling with together. I'm absolutely confident that our joint security cooperation endeavors, our strategic synergy, and our broadening ties across the entire spectrum of political and economic effort will continue to improve during this administration and beyond. Speaking directly to the subject of this forum today, and in answer to the question of risks versus opportunities in the U.S.-Israeli relationship, there will be, without question, more opportunities than ever before to bring our energies together in the next few years. And in so doing, we will create positive outcomes for both countries, and indeed, I think, for the larger region and for global peace and security. The Trump administration's Israel policy, first and foremost, centers on the commitment to guarantee Israel's ability to defend itself against the numerous dangers it faces in this very volatile region. With the support of sustained U.S. security assistance, Israel has developed one of the most advanced, formidable militaries in the world. This allows Israel to confront the many threats it faces, including from terrorist organizations such as Hezbollah, Hamas, and ISIS or Daesh, as well as from state actors such as Iran. The United States is committed to ensuring that Israel has the ability to overpower its adversaries and to protect its citizens. The President, the Vice President, Secretary Tillerson, Secretary Mattis, National Security Advisor General McMaster, and the entire apparatus of the U.S. administration are intent on strengthening the bilateral relationship and ensuring that our arms transfer policies, our economic assistance, and our military-to-military engagement with Israel build upon this long history of our commitment to the country. Under the Trump administration, our important collaborative efforts on counterterrorism, intelligence sharing, and counterproliferation will deepen even further. The historic Memorandum of Understanding that was signed by our two governments last September, which commits the United States to providing Israel with $38 billion in foreign military financing and missile defense support through 2028, will ensure that Israel has the resources that it needs to maintain state-of-the-art defense platforms and deter any external threat that it faces. As the person in the U.S. government who is charged with implementing the provisions of that memorandum, I can assure you that the Trump administration fully intends to use the unprecedented commitment outlined in that MOU as a guidepost for our defense relationship and further bolster our commitment to ensuring that Israel maintains its qualitative military edge in the region. Secretary Tillerson has taken a personal interest in ensuring and understanding the nuances of our security cooperation with Israel. He's been particularly adamant in affirming that the protection of Israel's qualitative military edge is the #1 priority when developing U.S. arms transfers policies towards Israel and the region. Recognizing the myriad threats facing Israel in the Middle East and beyond, our policy also means giving Israel access to some of the most cutting-edge weapon systems and aerial platforms that we produce, and further enabling Israel in those areas where it has established its own advanced capabilities. In the last year, Israel has declared initial operational capability for the Arrow 3 and David Sling air defense systems and has received delivery of its first 5 F-35 aircraft. I'm proud to say that joint U.S.-Israel production of the Arrow, David Sling, and Iron Dome systems has resulted in the deployment of one of the world's most advanced and integrated air defense systems. It's precisely this kind of innovation and cooperation that makes our security relationships so vibrant and so forward-looking. And we plan to encourage further joint ventures just like those in the coming years. The purchase of a cutting-edge, 5th-generation jet fighter is another testimony to our robust and interwoven security relationship. The eventual procurement of a total of 50 F-35 Adir aircraft will be a clear signal of Israel's military prowess in the region and another indication of the unshakable U.S. commitment to Israel's defense and security objectives. The challenges that Israel faces, as I've said, are substantial and profound. Israel, and we in support of Israel, will need to be vigilant in assessing these threats proactively and addressing them through political means as well as through military and security efforts. The dangers posed by the ongoing conflict in Syria and in Iraq are of long-term concern both to the U.S. and to Israel, fueling instability in the wider region and beyond. We're pressing forward on the Defeat ISIS campaign, an effort that I know my colleague, Special Presidential Envoy Brett McGurk, outlined in greater detail for this group earlier today. But that effort is going to take time. In the meanwhile, various elements in Syria and Iraq may continue to export terrorism and extremism and place pressure on neighboring states in the region. As another major concern related to Syria, Iran's support for the Assad regime intensifies the violence and compounds the suffering of the Syrian people. Iran has used Syria as a platform for its support to Lebanese Hezbollah, and the presence of these hardened fighters will continue to present long-term challenges to the U.S. and to Israel. Indeed, all of our partners in the region face the growing threat of Iranian aggression in various manifestations, although Iran maintains a particularly long-standing hostility towards Israel, as its support for Hezbollah and for Hamas attests. Again, in the spirit of the discussion here today and the idea of potential opportunities for the future, Israel's convergence of strategic interests with others in regard to this Iranian threat may present an opening for enhanced regional cooperation on security issues. President Trump conveyed this message fairly clearly during his May trip, noting that we must build a coalition of partners who share the aim of stamping out extremists and violence and providing our children a peaceful and a hopeful future. The U.S. administration will, in service of this objective, continue to encourage more normalized relations among our various regional partners. Finally, the United States will also promote Israeli and regional security by seeking sustainable, stabilizing political settlements to conflicts and to tensions in the region. In that vein, and as we saw through the presence here this week of the President's most trusted senior advisors, Jared Kushner and Jason Greenblatt, President Trump has also made clear his strong desire to forge a genuine and lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians, one that enhances stability in the region. U.S. officials here over the last few days discussed with Prime Minister Netanyahu potential next steps in that process, emphasizing that forging peace will take time and stressing the importance of doing everything possible to create an environment that is conducive to peacemaking. In that effort, as Vice President Pence said while celebrating Israel's Independence Day last month, while there will undoubtedly have to be compromises, you can rest assured that President Trump will never compromise the safety and the security of the Jewish state of Israel, not now and not ever. It's precisely this message of unwavering U.S. support for Israel's security that I'm here today to once again emphasize. But perhaps even more, it's my intent to underscore the concrete elements that we will make our security commitment live and prosper. We will work through political and military means to ensure that Israel has the wherewithal to survive and to thrive. And we will bring our promises to life by implementing our support in visible and in powerful ways. I want to thank you all for your time here today. I'm grateful very much for the chance to reaffirm what our highest levels of the U.S. government have been at pains to emphasize over the last few months of this new administration. I think I turn it back over to Dr. Bergman so that he can introduce the rest of the panel. Dr. Bergman, thanks. Thank you.
I welcome the panelists, my friends and colleagues, please. I will use the time to introduce everybody. And ladies first, Mary Beth Long served for many years during much of the 80s and the 90s as operations officer for the Central Intelligence Agency. And after 5 years in the private market, she came back to the Department of Defense, where she was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Counter-Narcotics, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Secretary Advisor on Asia, South Africa, and many other regions, and later on Europe, Middle East, and Africa. In 2007, she became the first woman to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate for an Assistant Secretary of Defense and served as in this capacity for International Security Affairs from 2007 and 2009. Thank you for coming. Ambassador Zalman Shoval was the Israeli ambassador to the United States in the years of 1990 to 1993, and 1998 to 2000, and earlier a member of the Knesset in the Rafi party of Ben-Gurion, and then in the Likud party, one of the founders of the Dayan Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the Tel Aviv University, and is currently member of the board of trustees in that center. He's also a member of the board of trustees of the Interdisciplinary Center Herzliya, IDC, and past chairman of the Center Institute of Policy and Strategy, which is the organizer of the Herzliya conference. In 2009, Prime Minister Netanyahu asked him to head the advisory forum on U.S.-Israeli relations. I think it's not a coincidence that Ambassador Shoval always played the role of the Israeli Prime Minister in the simulation and the war games played at the conference. I think that...
but it must be a coincidence that you always put me on the left.
Yeah, well...
It depends from which side you look.
Yeah, and I think that from the point of view of Ambassador Shoval, but maybe of others as well, it seems just natural that he could stay in the role of the Prime Minister. I'm not sure that Benjamin Netanyahu would adhere to this idea. I'm not going by sequence of sitting. Ambassador Dan Shapiro was the U.S. ambassador to Israel from 2011 until late 2016. A tough job. But the fact that you decided to stay in Israel is just maybe a proof that you did not suffer so much.
Didn't suffer at all.
And I just heard that the ambassador is going to stay for another year. During the 90s, Ambassador Shapiro served as a professional staff member on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, legislative assistant and senior policy advisor to Senator Dianne Feinstein, and later he sat in the National Security Council under President Clinton. Amos Hochstein, Amos, is a senior diplomat, special envoy, and coordinator for international energy affairs. Throughout his career, he was a counselor and lobbyist for both domestic and international oil gas companies, as well as companies focusing on renewable energy. As special envoy, Hochstein oversees the Bureau of Energy Resources and advisory Secretary of State on global energy security and diplomacy. October 8, 2015, President Barack Obama nominated Hochstein to be the Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources, the official chief position for the Bureau. Ambassador Dani Ayalon, an Israeli diplomat, columnist, and politician. He was a political advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu, Barak, and Sharon. Served as Deputy Foreign Minister and member of the Knesset for Israel Beitenu. He was the Israeli ambassador to the United States from 2002 until 2006. Member of the Israeli delegation to the Sharm el-Sheikh Accord, the Way Plantation Accord, and Camp David Accord. Frequently write for Israeli and international newspapers, notably Jerusalem Post and the Wall Street Journal. Gentlemen, lady and gentlemen, I would like to start with you, Ambassador Shoval, with trying to understand how do you think, if at all, the U.S. policy today is different than the one taken by President Barack Obama?
Yeah, first I'd like to react to your, introductory statement. I would say the whole relationship between the United States and Israel, especially since the Six-Day War, there have been some changes and there have been some permanent things. I think the permanent things actually exceeded the changes, but there were changes from administration to administration. And the permanent facts were more the positive ones than the negative ones. Notwithstanding which Israeli government, notwithstanding which American administration. I'd like to add to that from Israel's point of view, in spite of the fact that under the present government, under the present Prime Minister in recent years, Israel has been able to expand and extend its diplomatic international relations really without precedent, in other parts of the world, not just in the Middle East, in the Arab world, also in the Far East, India, and so on and so forth. In spite of all that, which is very favorable, our relationship with America is and will continue to be the prime source of our foreign policy, of our domestic policy, of our security policy. We do not have an alternative, nor do we want to have an alternative to the United States from that point of view. That should be clear. Yes, I think there are changes, there will be changes. We heard about some of those points of emphasis, I would say, just previously. But, you know, it's very difficult to predict something which is inherently unpredictable if we talk about the new American administration. I think that one very important change, which we already see, and not specifically with regards to Israel and America, is the change of American policy in the Middle East as a whole, which, of course, does affect Israel very, very, very directly. Under the Obama administration, we saw a trend of disengagement, I'd call, or perhaps there were different names for that, for changing the pivot, but disengagement from the Middle East. There was an increasing lack of American credibility since the Mubarak affair in Egypt, and all of our neighbors were directly affected by that. And I think that policy under the Obama administration, first of all, brought the Russians into the Middle East, facilitated the Iranian entry as a major player, direct player, in the Middle East, which threatens all of us. And all in all, I think weakened America's position itself in this part of the world, and perhaps in the world as in general. I think we already see a change. I won't even mention Syria because it's so very clear. I think we already see a change. I think Riyadh 2 weeks ago was symbolic of that change, but there will be additional changes. America has come back to the Middle East as a major power. It still has to, you know, to sort out some of the discrepancies, some of the controversies, the paradoxes with regards to Russia, and so on and so forth, especially in Syria. But all in all, I would say this is a positive development, an important development. And with regards, very, very briefly, to the bilateral relationship. The bilateral relationship, in spite of chemistries or atmospherics, I would say from administration to administration, including the Obama administration, has improved in concrete matters. Security, for instance. You can discuss it one way or another, but there has been an improvement. Yes, there were controversies, very serious ones, about Iran especially, about the nuclear deal, perhaps personal chemistry. Situation could have been worse if it hadn't been for the good efforts of Dan Shapiro here. But I think to look at it objectively, this was not a period where in concrete matters we actually stepped back. No, I don't think so. I think we shall continue to make progress, perhaps larger progress, in the Trump administration, as soon as we shall get to the nitty-gritty being, among other things, perhaps, first of all, the security, the Israeli-Palestinian,
which we will
on
get
that we'll talk separately,
Yep.
because I'm less sanguine about that.
Thank you. And we will get back to the policy of the Trump administration in a minute. But Ambassador Shapiro, first, congratulations on your new life. I'm sure that you do not miss the security details and maybe the whole entourage, but maybe you miss more the meetings and the frequent phone conversation with Prime Minister Netanyahu. You were one, if not the most popular, well-known American ambassadors to Israel. There are very few Israelis who don't know you. But on a broader perspective, don't you think that you made some mistakes, the president and yourself, with marketing your Israeli policy to the Israeli public? Don't you think that You know, they say about President George W. Bush that if he would run to be prime minister in Israel, he might win. I'm not sure that it would be the same with President Obama. What could you have done different to be more popular in Israel if you want to do?
Well, first of all, thank you, everybody, for the opportunity to be here. And I really want to answer the question by pivoting off of Ambassador Shoval's remarks and, in a way, off of Ambassador Kaidanow's remarks as well. The speech that I heard my good friend Tina Kaidanow deliver sounded very familiar to me. So many of the initiatives that were described on security cooperation are examples of continuity from the Obama administration into the Trump administration. That's true on the military assistance. That's true on the technology. That's true on the joint training. That's true on the intelligence sharing. And in that regard, it underscores what Ambassador Shoval said, is that even during a period when we had dramatic examples of disagreements, and in some cases they seem to dominate people's impressions about the relationship all told between the countries and certainly between the leaders. The facts and the substance of the policy was one that's actually strengthened the relationship, one that has provided a platform for our successors to build and carry it forward even more so. And to me, I think that's a story that is not sufficiently understood. Now, maybe we were part of not sufficiently making that understood. And this may be something to be done now in the mode of talking or writing about history. As much as President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu are often associated with those disagreements, and here personal chemistry matters, and of course the substance matters a lot, and the fact that they simply had a different interpretation of where the line was between a good agreement and a bad agreement on the Iran deal. Even though I think the broad strategic objective of preventing a nuclear Iran and being able to confront Iran's other malign behaviors around the region was shared completely, that shouldn't obscure the fact that the two of them, so associated with those disagreements, deserve credit for all of the areas of where the relationship was strengthened and advanced and is now being carried forward. When President Obama came here in 2013, I'd been here about a year and a half, and he had just been reelected, and Prime Minister Netanyahu had just been reelected, and they had an opportunity to spend some time together in a more relaxed setting, in a forward-looking mode. At that point, they hadn't had some of the big disagreements that came later, but even they had already had some. Remember the visit of
They will
Prime
still
Minister
hope that
Washington.
they will get along.
Yeah, well, remember the visit of the Prime Minister of Washington in 2011 and the sort of confrontational exchange in the Oval Office. But in those 3 days with President Obama going around the country, meeting Israelis of many different backgrounds, giving a very well-received speech to an audience of young Israelis, spending time in more relaxed settings, and some of the symbolic visits as well, Herzl's tomb and Yad Vashem and so on. I had so many Israelis come up to me after that experience and say, I really see President Obama differently now. I definitely disagree with him on this or that policy issue, but I can tell he is coming from a place of friendship. I can tell he has our best interests at heart. I can tell he cares about Israel's security and he cares about this relationship. That, of course, was an accurate impression. It was later obscured by all the many controversies. If I could have had him visit every 3 months or every 6 months to reinforce it, I would have gladly done so. I do think facts matter, and a proper and telling of this history with a little perspective and a little distance from the events themselves and the political and media swirl that surrounded them, I think and hope people will read it differently as well.
Mary Beth Long, just in January 2012, Leon Panetta, Secretary of Defense, said that Israel will strike Iran no later than April 2012. That was the U.S. intelligence prediction at that time. And it seems that from the point of view of the Obama administration, after the JCPOA, the Iran issue is more or less closed and now reopened by the current administration. How do you see the prospect of that going on? What sort of leniency? What sort of ground the current administration has after signing the agreement and not withdrawing from it? And just remind you that you said before when we met that you have provocative answers, so we are expecting one.
Well, this is sort of an easy one in that I do think that the Iranian situation is going to raise its ugly head again. It will probably be a place of general accord, but I do see some places where there will be some disconnect between what I think the Trump administration's position will be and that of Israel. And let's go back for just a moment. I think the first thing we have to keep in mind is that President Trump's policies are evolving. You see what it seems to be apparent disconnects between what he says as campaign Trump, what he tweets and what he articulates first off, and then what eventually ends up being policy. And I think that's because, number one, it's a very nascent administration. Number two, this is a businessman whose focus has changed, his scope has changed, and he's learning a tremendous amount as he moves. He's also taking upon himself the advice of his most important advisors. So I think there are nuances, but there will be important ones, particularly as to the Middle East. As to Iran, I think one of the biggest disconnects that you'll see is candidate Trump was very, very aggressive when it came to Iran. President Trump, to many surprise, said, let's wait and see what happens with the JCPOA. And we won't violate it. We'll allow things to go along. I think that's really, we won't discard it. I think that's really two things. Number one, it's allowing the Iranians to violate it, which I think there's a lot of confidence in the U.S. that will just be a matter of time if it hasn't happened already. And secondly, I think it's to allow to buy time to find out where Israel is on Iran. Israel itself, her rhetoric has all but stopped on Iran. You see much more internally focused and focused on the Palestinian issue. I think there was great hope until recently that Iran would be the subject or the bridge between Israel and some of her Gulf neighbors. I think that has shifted substantially in recent weeks, in part because of the lack of unity among the Gulf and Qatar. But I think you'll find that the Trump administration, like she is with North Korea, is, while extremely busy with emerging threats that are the result of a new president being threatened and tested by our enemies, will remain quite aggressive on Iran. And the question will be, will Israel...
In what sense? What the president can do?
I think the president is sincere, unlike others, that truly all options are on the table. And I think he would hope the same from Israel. Certainly that got the Iranians' attention in the past, and I think she will expect the same from Israel, and I'm not clear that Israel has made that decision. She seems to be extremely internally focused. It's an election period. I don't think the decision has been made. And I don't think that some of the efforts that the new administration had hoped for, sort of the outreach to possible Arab partners who have a coincidence of interests on this issue, have been made, and I don't think we see Bibi moving in those directions. So that there is probably a bigger gap on Iran, at least from a perception standpoint, between the U.S. and Israel than there was, say, during the end of the George W. Bush administration.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Dani Ayalon, what's going to happen with the Palestinians? I think that you would favor a much aggressive, maybe, or a much extensive involvement of U.S. policy inside that track, right?
Absolutely. I think that the United States is, as a former Secretary of State said, it's the indispensable country, certainly here in the Middle East and certainly in the track or trying to jumpstart the negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. But Ronen, let me first of all say thank you for this invitation. It's my pleasure to be here sharing this stage and panel with such distinguished colleagues. Thank you, the Herzliya Conference, and first and foremost, the chair, General Amos Gilad, turning into a professor, Amos Gilad, on the way. In any case, I think that maybe counterintuitively, there is a better chance under this current administration, the new Trump administration, to move forward with the Palestinians that we have seen maybe in the last quarter of a century since Oslo. And if we compare it to the former administration, I think there is a major contrast, almost a paradigm shift in two major areas. One, I think, is the outlook of the region. Whereas President Obama maybe saw that or looked at appeasing Iran maybe as a linchpin of stability in the region or trying to change the region, we see that Trump puts the premium on the Sunni countries. And by putting the premium on the Sunni countries and bringing them together with a de facto alliance between these countries and Israel, vis-à-vis ISIS, vis-à-vis Iran, Hezbollah, also stopping the expansion and the intrusion of Russia into the region, may be also very helpful in the Palestinian-Israeli track, because those countries certainly can have much leverage, encouragement, inducements, and maybe also some sticks vis-à-vis the Palestinians to come to the negotiation table. So this is number one. The second thing is, I think specifically on the track, whereby we saw in previous administrations a single track trying to move ahead, and also in a vertical way. Just first of all, putting all the onus on the settlements. Stop the settlements and then move forward. We see a different approach, which is more horizontal. That means you put into the mix all the core issues, understanding that you cannot just solve each issue by itself because they're all interconnected. And also there is more flexibility when you put everything on the same mix on the table.
That's there. Sorry for interrupting. Do you see President Trump forcing Prime Minister Netanyahu to sign a two-state solution?
Well, let's say it is not inconceivable. It is not inconceivable. On the one hand, we see the president and certainly members of the administration saying that a solution cannot be enforced, not can be coerced, and I believe in that. But on the other hand, I think that we see both from Israel and the Palestinian Authority kind of a wait-and-see approach where neither side want to really affront the new administration. I think that President Trump, and you may say he comes with some clear policies or without, nascent administration, still work in progress, but one thing is for sure, that he, by design or by default, he has increased American, let's say, deterrence capability, maybe because of its unpredictability, because people do not know what he thinks, what he does. Maybe some people think that he can flip on a dime. Neither side want to be on his bad side at this point, which I think is a great asset. Also, on the one hand, I think that President Trump may have the credentials to put the pressure on on Prime Minister Netanyahu because of his policy on the settlements, whereby he was limiting it, but certainly not taking a very extreme position of not even one brick in the settlements, not even in Jerusalem. I think this gives him credibility, and also bringing or forcing the Palestinians to come into the negotiation table without preconditions. So the short answer is yes.
Is yes. So we see that at least the Israeli speakers are quite in favor of the new administration in its U.S. Its Middle Eastern policy. Amos Hochstein, how do you see the energy market, the energy realm under the current presidency, in the sense of will that or could something that the current president does shutter the energy markets worldwide, especially when it comes to his new policy in the Middle East vis-a-vis the Gulf states?
Well, first, let me add my voice to thank you and to thank, I think I'll never be able to say Professor Gilad, so it's going to be General Gilad forever as far as our relationship, but thank you again for having me here. Before I get to the energy, because I think it's part of the move from the tactical to the strategic, the discussion that we've had just now, that we've listened to, looks at a relationship between the United States and Israel along traditional lines of the bilateral relationship. We could have had this conversation in June or July of 1989, 1993, and so on and so forth. It's how is it going to be different from the previous administration, thinking about campaign rhetoric as it relates to actual actions. I think I had exactly the same feeling as Dan did when Ambassador Kaidanow talked about how last September and we're implementing now, there's much more that transitions and continues between administrations than any administration likes to admit. So let's put away all the rhetoric. And let's look at it, and I'm not going to touch the Israeli-Palestinian issue in depth, except to say I think the biggest change now is that, I believe should be, is that the interest of Israel, an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, is not as much in the United States' interest as it is in Israel's interest. And therefore, there can be any moves, you can send emissaries and dialogues and everything else. If there's no basic decision and internalization in both society and political levels that a deal needs to be made, then the external actor is not going to be able to affect that. And therefore, I think you have to look at the relationship from a more strategic perspective. I obviously fundamentally disagree with a lot of that's been said on the characterization of the Obama administration's view of Israel and the relationship. I think that things were much more complicated. The idea that we say the words he wanted to appease Iran as though that is fact is troubling to me. It's not true. As though JCPOA, when it was signed, that was the end of the issue of Iran. We have President Obama inherited an Iran issue, an Iran involved in the Middle East post the war in Iraq and Saddam Hussein, which was the first beachhead in there, and had to deal with those issues. But I think what the United States, the importance of the relationship between Israel and the United States is not only about these tactical bilateral things that are all very important, military assistance, and et cetera. But it's also the relationships that the United States brings to all the issues that the Israeli press doesn't cover because they never happen. And that is the relationships that the United States has around the world, the ability to influence decision-making on policy decisions that affect Israel, that Israel is not able to do itself, but the United States, the countless amount of phone calls that the President, the Vice President, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense make to other capitals in order to make sure that that happens are important. The second piece is the strategic element that you asked about. This is not only a changing dynamic region because of Syria and Iraq and Yemen. The region has problems that have nothing to do with Israel. The strategic interest of the region, of the Gulf, it's tied to oil prices. The revolution in the energy sector that is not repeating previous cycles, that has the potential, the need for countries to really tackle this in a very different way. Nothing is more important in the region than in the Gulf region than energy markets. The U.S. adding 5 million barrels a day of production was as much a contributor to some of the tension as some other issues, except it's not discussed. We discuss economic and political security in two different silos. It's not true in many parts of the world. It's not true in Russia. It's not true in the Gulf. It's not true in other parts. It's integrated and interconnected. And therefore, we have to look at the region that Israel is living in through not only one prism. We have to look through multiple prisms of what is the interest of the countries in the region. How do they see their future? And is Israel even a factor in the way they see the broader region and themselves? And dramatic things are happening in UAE and Saudi.
Don't you agree with the, I think, common view by many Israelis that nowadays many of the Sunni countries in the region feel that they are back at the center of the U.S. policy, Pax Americana, and they feel better than under President Obama?
You know, we're in June. He's been president since January 20th. I'm not judging
it's like
negatively,
ages. It's like
negatively or positively. But I think in this region, people would get used to the fact that a trip to Saudi Arabia, a trip to Israel, 5 months in, is not necessarily the reason or the basis for long-term projections of U.S. policy in the region. A lot's going to happen. Some of it we can project, much of it we cannot, and when we think we can, we're probably wrong. So let's have that conversation next year. I think it's more important to say, has it changed and what's the Trump administration's policy? I think Mary Beth is right. We're 5 months in. I don't know. I don't think they know what the policy is going to be in a year from now. So let's take a deep breath, figure out what's the interest for Israel to figure out its interests, let other countries figure out their interests and how they interact. the relationship between the United States and Russia has never been more important to Israel than since the end of the Cold War. A deal on Syria is going to involve Russia in Syria on the border with Israel. That's an important issue. It's not a Israel-Palestinians. It's not a military issue. These are strategic ways of thinking, and I would recommend that everybody think about what is our strategic interest? What is our plan? What would we like it to look like? Versus trying to guess and read the tea leaves from one or two meetings without knowing how they play out. So I think that would be my, I'll
Thank
stop
you.
there.
Mary Beth Long, you want to add something?
Yeah, I just want to add, I couldn't agree more. And I also think there's a very real danger. We've talked to like a bilateral relation, the U.S. and Israel, the U.S. and Israel, as if it were 20 years ago. And there are other important changes, and that is the U.S. does not have the leverage for all the optimism on the case of our Sunni partners, and I think they're wildly optimistic. I would ask them to mitigate their expectations or certainly manage them. But the U.S. does not have the leverage in the region that it used to have, and its ability to affect change on behalf of Israel is greatly diminished, and Trump is not going to change that, in part because of the gas and other issues, but also in part because of the geography. And it is not going to be enough to have the U.S. on your side anymore. And I worry, I don't hear Israel with a strategic plan about building its alliances in its regions so that it doesn't find itself as the bastion, isolated friend of the U.S. With war and real threats on all sides. You have a golden opportunity that I don't hear much strategic talk about, where for the first time you have coincidence of interest with the Sunni, where they have actually given you lots of space on the Palestinian issue, but it's still important, and there's no real discussion about, from a strategic long-term interest of Israel, the Palestinian issue has more strategic importance about how your neighbors are going to look at you than it did before, but it's less important to them about how they deal with you individually than ever before. And that's an important point, and I just don't hear it being strategically discussed.
General Professor Amos Gilad was always arguing and fighting to have strategic planning, not always successful, unfortunately, and once being general with the military intelligence, at least as a rumor, he said Israel doesn't yet have a concrete proof that there is a country called Saudi Arabia. Ambassador Shapiro, I would like to expand on that last point of how other allegedly unrelated issues do influence the U.S.-Israeli relations. What just happened between the U.S. and NATO? Sure. The withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, the recent Trump visit to Europe that was not extremely successful, I think, as described by many of the observers. Would that have an effect on Israeli?
Undoubtedly it will. I'll touch on it in a minute just to connect it back to the points that Amos and Mary Beth made. It's clearly the case that Israel has an opportunity to build on the strategic alignment with the Sunni Arab states. There is a certain unreality in the way that's often discussed around this country that it's disconnected from the Palestinian issue. The Sunni Arab states don't care about the Palestinian issue. And it may be true that you can go there and spend, as many of these colleagues have done, spend an hour or two or three in a meeting and only the United States official raises the Palestinian issue. It doesn't mean at all that those leaders are prepared to be seen as throwing the Palestinians under the bus and willing to take on the domestic political costs and even some regional political costs in the competition with Iran that it would appear that if they move to normalize with Israel before there's progress on that. But look, I do think President Trump had a successful visit in the Middle East. I think the visit in Saudi Arabia and the trying to build the coalition of the moderate Sunni Arabs against the extremist, Iranian-backed and Sunni elements in the region was successful. Clearly, the visit here was warm and reinforced all the commitments about the United States toward Israel and has given him and his team, Jared Kushner and Jason Greenblatt, a platform to try to advance Israeli-Palestinian talks. I think they have leverage. I think they should move quickly to use it and put some decisions before the parties. But I've been very publicly supportive about that. Having said that, he went on from this part of the world to Europe and had a truly disastrous visit. He refused to endorse the Article 5 commitment of the NATO Charter. He did it 2 weeks later in the Rose Garden with the Prime Minister of Romania. Doesn't matter. The damage was done. He publicly lectured our NATO allies on their defense spending obligations, the 2% of GDP. Probably the single worst way of getting politicians who have to make those decisions with their parliaments and with their publics to actually do that. Days later, he withdrew from the Paris Accords despite being urged not to do so by many of those European leaders. To me, this sets up the United States negatively for our influence and our leadership in Europe, but more broadly in the community of democracies that we try to think of ourselves as the leader of. And I think it affects Israel in 2 or 3 very negative ways. One is it says something about the credibility of U.S. commitments and the willingness of the United States to sustain that leadership, to come in and immediately withdraw from international agreements, whether it's the TPP Asian Trade Agreement, whether it's the Paris Accords, and then to be seen as in tension, to create tension with allies that we have stood with together for 70 years against a true threat, which is Russian aggression in Central and Eastern Europe, is to call into question whether U.S. commitments and credibility and leadership can be counted on anywhere, and that's very much an Israeli interest. Secondly, I think there's at least the potential for some substantive disagreements between the United States and Israel, something that does occur, and that's natural between the two countries, but we do try to avoid. We try to avoid situations where the United States and Israel are public odds over issues, and the Paris Accords comes to it. Israel's a strong supporter of the Paris Accords. I don't know any Israeli who doesn't want to see that continue and doesn't want to see Israel be a leader. Certainly Israel's leadership in the clean energy sector gives it great opportunities. But we could find ourselves in a situation where the Trump administration says to Israel, hey, we are your biggest supporters. We're defending in the United Nations everywhere. We're standing up for Israel everywhere. Why aren't you standing with us when we're isolated, having isolated ourselves on the Paris Accords? And the third problem I think it creates has to do with Israel's own self-definition. Israel wants to be thought of, is thought of correctly as a democratic state. This is part of the problem with the Palestinian issue. Can it stay Jewish and democratic? But as long as it can, it wants to be in that community of democracies. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't disagreements within that. Obviously, Israel and Europe have their tensions over the Palestinian issue. But what happens when there's a sharp divide? What happens when the camp itself is pulled apart and Israel has to pick sides? I think it was said Israel's always going to go with the United States because that's its strongest security guarantee, and it should. But does Israel really want to be in a situation where it's pulled between a camp of, let's say, Macron and Merkel and Trudeau on one side and Trump and Putin and Duterte and Erdogan on the other side? I don't think that suits Israel to have to make those kinds of choices about its own self-definition and where it positions itself internationally.
Ambassador Shoval, we'll pick up from that point. If you were the Israeli ambassador now to Washington, sitting in that room, I think at the second floor of the embassy, free from bugging devices, and writing your memo to the Prime Minister, and you would need to advise him whether to align with the U.S., no matter what, align with the Trump administration, even if the Trump administration supports Russia and is at odds with Europe. Would you do that? Or would you say Israel should have a more balanced policy?
Well, first of all, I would strive not to have a black or white sort of dilemma. I think in the present situation, we actually see before our eyes a very close relationship with the United States, strategic and otherwise, but to have a tactical sort of relationship with Russia in our interest with regards to what's happening in Syria, with regards that's happening with Hezbollah and might happen in the future. We should continue to try to strike that balance. If theoretically it came to a war between America and Russia, which I don't think will happen, but if it came to that, I think Israel will find itself on the American side without any hesitation in that respect.
But if President Trump strikes a deal with Russia, that would, at the end of the day, be on the expense of Israeli interests. That, for example, Israel is completely forbidden to strike armament, weaponry, advanced weaponry convoys from Syria to Hezbollah, which it has been doing according to non-Israeli sources during the last 5 years. that could be in direct contradiction to Israeli interests.
We have been in similar situations in the past, not exactly in that respect, but when there was an American Soviet cooperation during the Carter era on the peace process, and Israel fought against that diplomatically and successfully. But if it came to a military sort of question, a security question, I think that any Israeli government would, at the end of the day, take a decision which conforms with Israel's own security interest, even if it creates a crisis with our best ally, the United States, hopefully trying to avoid it by means one way or another, through Congress, through other ways. But I think when it comes to an existential threat to Israel, Israel will have no choice but to act according to its own self-interest, trying to avoid this sort of confrontation, of course.
Yeah, and that's the Ayalon. If you try to imagine what is happening in that room between the Prime Minister, Israeli Prime Minister, and that team Kushner-Greenblatt, what are they trying to achieve now?
Well, first of all, I think they all come from the same kind of mindset, which I think is very helpful for Israel. I think the fact that also they try to get credibility with the Palestinians and certainly with the Arab countries is very, very important. And so far, they seem to succeed. And in that respect, I think it's a matter of trust and credibility. And I think from Netanyahu's point of view, he can trust Kushner or Ambassador Friedman or Jason Greenblatt. And
trying to say that he couldn't trust the previous ones represented?
Well, I don't know if he couldn't, but the perception was that he didn't. And I can tell you one example, for instance, is, and this is where I do not think that Israel could be in a position of a conflict in a Russian-American, let's say, pact here. One of the main Israeli complaints was during the Vienna deal, JCPO, was that Israel was not included, or certainly wasn't included early on. And in a way, it was presented with a fait accompli. I don't think that with Kushner and the Trump administration cast now, this could happen. So in case there is a big deal between the United States and Russia, I believe Israel will be there from the start, taking care of Israeli interests. And again, maybe because President Trump does not come from a school of political science or more of a business, he can think of things which are out of the box. And this, something that Israel will have to analyze and position itself. I can see a situation whereby Trump is trying to get a deal with Putin on the Middle East where Russia is ditching in some sort Iran and gaining its interest in the Ukraine. That is, Iran for Ukraine. I think that could be something that maybe was not conceivable before. It is now. Also, I think the world is changing, this political, cultural, economic, technological, the things that were not imaginable just 5 years ago can be imaginable now. In any case, I believe that whatever comes across us, it is very important for us to be very much, not just on the American side, as a statist or as a passive actor, but as a very, very engaged one. And I think there is a great opportunity in this time to do that.
Amos Hochstein, would you support such a deal, Iran against Ukraine, and while during that way to have a Russian support for Israeli-Palestinian deal?
I don't know what Ukrainians did to you.
They would love it.
I think that's not how it works. We're the United States. We have interests around the world, and we don't do trades.
Amos, nothing works as it used to anymore.
By the way, I think that's definitely true today. But it tends to always be true because dynamics happen in ways that we don't expect. But the idea that you would do a trade with Russia, I mean, this is a pre-World War, post-World War I type of, or even pre-World War I type of engagement. The Maidan and our strong support for Ukraine is an independent policy of the United States that really doesn't have much to do with Syria. There is a lot of the conspiracy theory of how do you tie it all in and so on, and and maybe other countries, maybe Russia would like to signal its strength by warming up by heating up, the conflict in Ukraine in the east. But I don't see the United States abandoning the people of Ukraine, abandoning freedom and democracy in Ukraine, and abandoning the millions of dollars that we've spent on supporting a new government in Ukraine. However, what concerns me more is the constantly thinking about what's that easy deal that we can all make, that the magic bullet that puts it all together. I would say the single thing that concerned me most of anything else of being here for 2 days at the conference mostly in listening mode is that there is a sense of being able to skip over pieces as though, as Ambassador Ayalon just said, everything has changed now, so we can also change the parameters of how the Middle East works from Israel's perspective. So there was a lot of discussion about the regional approach to the Middle East now, the Sunni versus Shia, even though we have a little cracks there, and how Israel can fit into this. And therefore, if you listen to the presentations yesterday evening, they were all about, we're going to skip the Palestinian thing, we're just going to go straight to a new regional Israel and the Sunni Arab states and so on. I want to pick up on what Dan said on that. It's not only that the other side doesn't raise the issue, that's true, but absent, and that there's certain symmetry of viewpoints regarding Iran, and even there, not entirely, the idea that without a already completed settlement, or at least most of the way there between the Israelis and the Palestinians, that there would be a normalization of relations between Israel and the Gulf. Look, I'm out of government a lot of days. I think that's fantasy. And I think the faster that Israeli discourse moves away from it and discredits it, the better it is for Israel's national security. Because it would take that, if it requires testing it out and failing, it's going to be a loss of a lot of time. So I would just urge the injection of a little bit of reality into that approach, because I fear there that could be misleading. The second piece of that is what I started, which is, yes, there's some symmetry between seeing Iran as a threat. We all see Iran as a threat. I think you can get to very different conclusions, though, on an operational policy as a result of that common theory. We, the Obama administration, believed that Iran was a threat to Israel, its neighbors, Europe, the United States, and the world. And that is why we supported and negotiated the JCPOA, because we believe that that was the best way to do it. I can understand that people disagree with that notion, but it comes from the same basic assessment of threat. The Gulf assesses the threat of Iran also, but its conclusions are not always the same. Remember, there's enormous amounts, from a dollar perspective, remarkable amount of trade that still happens on a day-to-day basis between the Gulf and Iran across multiple sectors. So while having that assessment of threat. So this is a lot more complicated. It's not as fairy tale land where, well, we're now on the boat, we have the same common enemy, so we're going to agree on everything and let's just be brothers. That's not going to happen. There are some traditional things, and that's why I go back to, this is not about Jason Greenblatt, and not about Jared Kushner, and not about President Obama. They can be as good as they are, and I wish them, as an American, I wish them well, I wish them luck, and I hope they put our country on a good path. However, the issue of the Palestinians, what gets thwarted from administration to administration is, if you don't have the will here and a realization of the time running out on a potential deal, and the narrative of a two-state solution not being there forever, if you don't buy that, and you don't have to, nobody makes Israel or the Palestinians buy anything, but if Israel doesn't buy that this is a time running out, then you can have all the emissaries and the involvement of the President of the United States. You're not going to have a successful deal. And therefore, you should then turn to other strategic interests of Israel of how it wants to survive in the neighborhood and in the world, reassessing its national security interests and potential opportunities.
I just noticed, by the way, that you, Amos, and Ambassador Shapiro, you are much more acquainted to the Israeli custom, and you do not wear ties. And we three Israelis, we do, which is much better.
It's called
to be
leaving the administration.
It's the best reason to stay in Israel.
We were told it's an American panel.
Mary Beth Long, what advice would you give to the negotiators on behalf of the Trump administration, how to convince the Israelis that time is not working on our behalf, that there need to be some sort of compromise, and unless the Israelis come close to that point, nothing would move ahead?
A little tough love, frankly, and I fully agree with everything you said. But I think there's a disconnect between the timeline that Israel thinks she has and what I think is a realistic timeline of what is going to go down in the region. I was shocked today, like my colleagues, to hear some people. It seemed to be advocating that we're going to have a somehow normalization of relationships and trade and recognition with the Gulf states and put the Palestinian issue to the side, and this is all going to be built on the fact that we're now allegedly trading information, and this will give Israel some breathing space. Au contraire, between the Sunni now divided between the Qatari camp, which either includes Erdogan or Russia and or Iran making overtures, with the KSA, with Saudi, with a new leadership, catapulting itself into a 2030 plan that is incredibly aggressive and probably will not deal sufficiently with a demographic problem, with Egypt going to increase its population to the tune of 120 plus million Egyptians within the next 15 years, I believe. Some 60 to 70% who will not have jobs. Time is running out for Israel to have allies in this region that are going to keep it from being isolated. And there is only so much the U.S. can and will be able to do. And if you look at an economic perspective, the U.S. as a practical matter, whether it's from an energy perspective or others, is increasingly looking at the Gulf. The largest transfer in humankind of capital, of money, ever in the history of the world occurred over the last 15 years, and it went to the Gulf. And oh, by the way, it's moving from the Gulf into East Asia. And that's just a reality. You also have a fundamental change in U.S. voters that Trump is just the latest manifestation of, and that's not going to go away either.
We didn't see that yesterday.
Yes, we did. Yes, we did. And it's not going to change. And it's going to look increasingly isolationist, but that's not it. It's increasingly what is in it for me, the U.S. And when it comes to Israeli aid and coming to Israel's defense, that will never change from a fundamental perspective, but it is going to change on the surface, and it's just not sustainable.
Thank you. We'll have one last round. We will start with Ambassador Shoval. You'll have your comments, but then I'll have one question I would like to ask all of you, but be very precise, crisp, and short. How do you see, give us a forecast for the coming year until the next Herzliya conference, what is going to happen in the Middle East, in the U.S.-Israeli relation? We are Chatham House rules. There are no journalists here, so it's going to stay between us. Nobody would hold you accountable. Ambassador, please.
Yeah, I don't want to get into an argument about the last two statements, which I think were a bit unrealistic about what's really happening in the Middle East.
So you think that the Times is working on our behalf?
I don't, for the last 50 years we have heard the present situation is unsustainable. That we heard for 50 years.
Doesn't mean it's not true.
I'm not happy about it having been like that, but it was sustainable, it was sustained. And I don't think time is running out. Actually, I think time is working in favor of Israel, which does not mean that tomorrow we're going to have an Israeli-Saudi friendship society. I agree with that. As long as the Palestinian issue remains, Arab leaders will not be able to ignore what they call the street, the populace. I agree with that. But we must look in proportion, things in proportion. I think what most Israelis, not all Israelis, certainly the Prime Minister at the present time, they stand before a certain dilemma, a choice, or perhaps not a choice, between the unacceptable or impossible, namely a Palestinian state now, in the situation of the Middle East, the turmoil, with Hamas surely to take over the West Bank if it comes to that, and the undesirable, which means a one-state solution, which would be the end of Jewish state. I won't even get into the matter of democratic state. Therefore, any Israeli responsible prime minister must try to influence our American friends that the only way is to reach interim agreements, not to hope for something which is unachievable. The ultimate peace agreement that President Trump has been talking about is very good, very hopeful, but it's unachievable. It's not going to happen. And then the question will be, what happens when President Trump realizes in a year from now, perhaps less, perhaps more, that he's not going to get that...
He's very speedy, so it's probably happen earlier.
He's not going to get that ultimate peace. What will his reaction be? Will he just walk away from it, like some presidents did, some presidents did not? Or will he try to put pressure on us, on the Palestinians? Will he try to use his contacts with the rest of the Arab world? The answer to that is still very much in the air. But I think Israel's position should be, and I think is, certainly if we talk about Prime Minister Netanyahu, ultimately we want to be separated from the Palestinians. But what the exact formula of that will be, when this will happen, this depends on developments in the Middle East and developments in the world as a whole. We are not going to endanger something which is not going to bring peace, not an end of conflict, but certainly increase the jeopardies, the security jeopardies to the state of Israel.
Thank you. Amos Hochstein, your anticipation and assessment for the coming months.
My predictions this year regarding Brexit and the election of Donald Trump have has disqualified me from making any predictions ever again. So I'm going to refrain. I will say, Ambassador Shoval talked about the last 50 years, people saying it's not sustainable, and it was. I would say the last 50 years, Israel has seen 4 wars and 3 skirmishes. I would argue that they may have been right. I am not trying to suggest, though, that I know the answer. I'm just saying that, in agreeing with part of your statement, that what the Trump administration does to me doesn't matter. What matters is if Israel decides time is running out, or if Israel doesn't decide time is running out. If Israel wants a deal that will require things that it wasn't willing to do yesterday, then go down this path. If it doesn't want to, don't waste the time of another 2 years or 1 year, as you said, who knows how long, and then get into an uncomfortable conversation with the administration that has just poured their first 2 years into a midterm election with nothing to show for it. Make that decision at the front end. That's all I'm saying. I don't think it's in the U.S. interest as much as it was before, and as much as it is in Israel's interest. But my opinion doesn't matter. It's Israel has to make that decision and not do the same old play over again. I think we're in a different world for that to be right.
Ambassador Shapiro,
I'll
please.
be very brief.
Will be done in a few minutes.
I think it's a question more of decision points than of being able to predict exactly what those decisions will be on the Palestinian issue. I agree very much with what Amos was just saying, that it's probably true. There is not going to be a breakthrough in the ultimate deal in the next year. I wish the Trump administration well. As I said, I think they have some leverage, but we know the leaders, we know the constraints,
Inshallah.
we know the reasons why it's difficult. But Israel does face a question. If the two-state solution is still desirable as an end state, there is some tipping point out there. I hope it's still ahead of us and not behind us. You sometimes don't know you're past the tipping point until you're well past it, when it's not going to be achievable. So what hedges can be put in place to make sure it's still viable, if it's in 1 year or 10 years or 20 years, when the region's better, when the Palestinian leadership is better, but there is a point when it won't be viable. The decision point I think the United States is going to face is in Syria, and it could be really an agonizing one. as the ISIS campaign is meeting success and ISIS is disintegrating and the territory it controls is now up for grabs, we are finding U.S. forces or U.S.-backed forces coming into conflict with Assad regime or Iranian or Hezbollah or Russian-backed forces. And this could very, very quickly lead the administration to have to make a really agonizing choice. President Donald Trump was not elected to have a full-scale U.S. military engagement in eastern Syria. But if we decide we're only going to protect certain territories or back our Sunni moderate allies up to a certain point, we could end up with an Assad, Iran, Russia big-time strategic win, and that could be very, very difficult for Israel's interests.
Mary Beth Long, very, very short.
It's not the last 50 years. The one thing that the Sunni Arabs learned from the Obama administration is that if I'm unhappy with you, I'll cut off your precision-guided weapons, and that Iran's going to have a nuclear program someday. And they will not exist in this area with Iraq being unstable, and I think that's the foreseeable future, with Yemen being unstable, that's the foreseeable future, with Syria being unstable, that's the foreseeable future. They are going to defend themselves. QME only applies to sales between the U.S. and Israel. It doesn't apply to Russia, and it doesn't apply to China. Israel is going to have to make some tough choices, and the next year from the United States is going to be confusing because we don't have the people in place and we're still developing our policy. You guys have got to step out.
Ambassador Ayalon.
Well, in 1 year time,
Tough choices.
I see that the Palestinian track is moving, however, very, very slowly, without any fanfare, without any summit and photo opportunities. I see actually the shift and the focus going elsewhere in the region. The problems in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, problems, of course, in continued instability in Iraq and Iran, and Syria, with even more instability as the Kurdish problem issue is going to act up. And I think that there should be a lot of focus on what's happening in that area. I think ISIS is going to strike even with more intensity, unfortunately, in Europe and other areas. And at the end of the day, I think that, again, the Palestinian track will be divorced from other issues in the area which are very, very explosive. As far as Israel goes, we will continue to develop our technology. We'll leave off our intellectual property. We'll find some more natural gas and other things. And we will wait for some concessions on the Palestinians and not just thinking of ours.
And I'm sure that if we would have another hour, we could completely solve the Middle East dispute, but we don't. Join me in thanking our panelists, Ambassador Ayalon, Mary Beth Long, Ambassador Shapiro, Amos Hochstein, Ambassador Shoval. Thank you very much. Thank you all.